Hello and welcome. I'm Ganita Nkori, the Henry and Lois Foster Director and Chief Curator of the Rose Art Museum, and thank you for joining us for Encore Presentations, a series highlighting standout programs from the archives, celebrating our museum's history of engaging artists in critical conversations. Tonight's Encore presentation is from 2016 and was part of the Art, Race, Activism initiative. The program features distinguished artist and activist Rick Lowe in dialogue with former Rose Director Christopher Bedford. I hope you enjoy tonight's Encore presentation, and please visit the museum's YouTube channel at youtube.com/@RoseArtMuseumBrandeis for more engaging programming related to contemporary art. Enjoy the program.
Okay, does everyone hear me? So, welcome. My name is Chris Bedford. I'm the director of the Rose Art Museum, and I'm shocked to see so many people in the crowd. I almost didn't come in myself. It's so beautiful outside.
At least we have the door.
I know we have the door. Well, we can see the outside. You guys, unfortunately, can't. Sorry. So it's my pleasure to be here this afternoon with Rick Lowe. This is it's actually the last of our Art, Race and Activism in Integrated Arts Project series that's featured an abundance of incredible artists, Rick among them. And I wanted to mention just before we begin that this is actually not the only talk that we're asking Rick to give. He's also giving another at 3:30 tomorrow in the multi-purpose room of the Shapiro Campus Center. So we'll look forward to that one as well.
Well, that one I'll talk more specifically about the work and have work samples.
Very good.
Yeah.
Very good. So I wanted to say a couple of brief thank yous before we begin. This is the series of talks have been undertaking across the Academy, and we have lots of people to thank for it. The AAAS department, who are variously represented in the audience, the Rose Art Museum, as always represented in the Fine Arts department as well. It's been a terrific series, and we've had Director Crosby as a resident, who was here very, very recently. And I know you were here for a couple more days at least. So, I'm not going to say too much to introduce you, since you'll be introduced through your work, but a couple of interesting points. Rick was trained as a painter and abandoned that practice in the 90s to embrace the kind of work that he's been known for since, and will be the principal subject of our discussions here. Like a couple of the artists we've had on Brandeis' campus in the last couple of years, Rick was a MacArthur Fellow. He won that award in 2014. And we share the common bond of being on Mark Bradford's Board of Trustees for his not-for-profit Art and Practice. So I think I wanted to begin our conversation actually by gesturing towards that project and why you might be on that board, and your role as the grandfather of social practice, let's say, a very young grandfather of social practice in the United States. But so in the spirit of beginning that discussion, I'm going to read to you a quote which actually Tori Fair sent to me a couple of days ago, and it's from Klaus Oldenburg, and he says, "I am for an art that is political, erotic, mystical. Something that does something other than sit on its arse," he said arse in the British sense, in a museum. So I get the sense that your transition from painting to what you do now had something to do with that sentiment.
Absolutely. And actually, I actually had a high school student to tell me that, to give me that critique, to tell me to just, make something that gets off his ass.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that was like a big revolution for me.
Okay.
But you were talking about Mark, the art and practice, right?
Yeah, I mean, so that's a relatively young not-for-profit that has a very specific mission in LA, and maybe you could discuss that a little bit, and then the role that you've played in helping him shore up the foundation of the organization.
Yeah. Well, so everybody in the audience know Mark Bradford. Yeah.
Yes.
So actually, there's a funny history to that that goes back to, I think maybe like 96. So I was doing a show at LA Mocha, let's call it Uncommon Sense. And so I was spending a lot of time there, and that's when I formulated the idea for this project called the Watts House Project. And I met a lot of young artists at the time that were around, and I'd just meet people and kind of just keep going. And I met this one artist, Edgar Arsenault, who was very aggressive in his kind of in his approach. So I met him, and he never went away. He just kind of stuck around all the time. And so he later became the person that carried forth the Watts House Project. I met Mark Bradford around the same time. But, I met Mark, and, we kind of talked a little bit, and he went on his way. Well, I didn't know this, but for about 10 years there, he felt slighted. He felt like I slighted him. He was like, well, you wouldn't be, like, connected with that Arsenault guy, So why wouldn't, So anyway, so it was just kind of this ongoing thing. And then when we talked about it, we were like, oh, my God, that's such a strange thing. And then, and at that point, that must have been probably about 10 years ago that we reconnected, and then we started talking about the old stuff, and then we just kind of started moving along. I mean, he was really doing great in his in terms of with his paintings and studio practice. But I think it was when he was in New Orleans that we really connected, when he made this gesture in the Lower Ninth Ward to actually do something that was more that had a different agenda. It was about empowering people within the community. And so it was at that point that we started to have conversations about it. But I would say it was we did a public talk together, Mark and I, at USC in maybe 2009. And I tried to connect his practice to social and community engaged art. And he completely denied it. I mean, we had a long fight on stage about why. I was saying why it was, and he was saying why it wasn't. And then, so, you roll forward a few years later, then he started thinking about doing art and practice. So then we started, and now I always tell him, I told you so. Yeah, so that's, and so anyway, so as he started to think about that, though, I was kind of a resource for him. Well, same with the Esther, too. It's kind of a resource for folks that are trying to figure out, how do you get into the murky waters of community.
So that's another artist who was here very recently. We have a sort of cadre of people we revisit again and again, and I think it's in part because we have a very committed social agenda at Brandeis, and we're trying to imagine the future of that social agenda in the 21st century, and the Astor has been incredibly helpful, Mark too, and you of course. I think it's interesting, when Theaster was here and I was talking.
I got Theaster here too. I got him on Theaster boots.
You got Theaster boots? Yeah, that's nice.
I talked him out of it. Okay.
Are they actually his?
Yeah, they're actually his.
I thought they were just
no.
in the manner of Theaster.
No. I think it was about 2 years ago, maybe almost 3 years ago. Theaster called me up and he said, I don't know, somehow I was talking about something about bell hooks. And he says, man, I want to meet Bell Hooks. And I said, well, I'll call her up and we'll just go out there, out in Kentucky. She loves to have visitors. And so I arranged it. So I arranged with Theaster and Suzanne Lacey. Because Suzanne had done a lot of work in Appalachia, in Kentucky. So we go out there and we hung out for a few days. And Theaster had on these nice boots, and I just kept eyeing them. I kept eyeing them. And then actually this year in January, I think it was, we were both doing something at the Ford Foundation, whatever, and he brought this bag, brown paper bag, and said, "Here, this is for you." And I was like, "What do you mean?" I opened up and it was these boots. He gave them out.
So you literally took the shoes off his feet.
Absolutely.
Very good. We had a conversation, Theaster and I, with Anita Hill, which was a great privilege for me, at Le Laboratoire in Cambridge. And one of the questions I posed to begin with is, if you take stock of what you're doing, you take stock of what he's doing, you take stock of what Mark's doing, all in the 21st century, the New York Times picked up on this, so it's in the air. I posed the question of, does this interest in mobilizing art as a way to impose sustainable social change constitute a kind of movement? And he was very resistant to that, as I kind of knew he would be.
Who, Theaster was?
Theaster was very resistant to that. But I'm going to pose it to you. Maybe you have a different answer or a different inflection on his answer.
That's interesting. You know, of all people, I would have thought that he would say that it was a movement. I mean, because that's kind of his ambition, you know, like be like bigger. You know, to me, it's like I think we're, you know, I think there has been a movement of community and socially engaged work for a long time, you know, before any of us. I think the value that we're bringing to it, though, is that we're bringing it into context of contemporary art in a way that it hadn't been, you know, in the past. And so that's the, you know, so I wouldn't think that what we're doing specifically constitutes a movement, but I do think that there has been a movement for a long time that has not really gotten its due, because for some reason, whenever work seemed to make its way down to the most needy, and the communities or people that are most needed, it somehow finds a way to the resources find a way to disconnect and go to another place. Yeah.
So I was speaking to a journalist about this subject recently, and he was gesturing towards various precedents for the way that you work, the way Mark works, and my feeling was, talking about Mark specifically, well, no, you can't really find a precedent. You can find a social activist, and you can find de Kooning, and you can put them together, and maybe you get Mark Bradford. So he was saying, well, maybe there are other precedents you're not thinking of, people like Ad Reinhardt, or Barnett Newman. So his contention is those people are incredibly politically involved, very politically active, and had a painting practice in parallel. So that to me feels fundamentally different from everything you're doing, everything he's doing, everything Fiesta thinks about.
I actually find that what I'm doing is very different than what Mark's doing. I mean, as a whole, as our careers, and also what Fiesta did. They're very different. You know, I think mine is kind of that. You know, I kind of went all in. You know, I mean, I just kind of said, you know what, I'm going to make this my practice. You know, and this is my practice. You know, there are no other things to kind of confuse it with and that kind of stuff. And
so let me just interrupt. I feel like to do justice to the audience, what we should do is just rewind completely to the moment that you abandoned painting in the 90s, and you start beginning to think about Project Row House.
Yes.
So I think talking about the beginnings of that as it's the emblem of who you are as an artist would be really useful for the audience.
Yeah. Okay. Would that be useful?
I think so.
Okay. Well, so that beginning, goes back to the thing about doing something that gets off his ass. Okay, so when I was painting, I was making paintings about political and social issues and stuff. But then, like I said, this young student came to me and said, while your paintings and sculptures show what's happening in the community, communities don't need that. Because they already know what's happening, they're living with it. So if you're an artist and you're creative, why can't you create a solution? So that was a turning point, that was a challenge, that's what I had to respond to. And so the response was, first of all, was just to say, you know, I have to close up shop. I mean, I have to close up studio and try to, you know, just do some research. You know, figure out, you know, what does it mean to be an artist who's making something that actually have a practical application. So in order to do that, to me, I started with the practical side. I just said, okay, well, first of all, I have to really root myself in a community and take on the concerns that the community is taking on as an activist. See, that's the difference between Mark, Fiesta, and myself, is that Mark would never use the language activist so much. And Fiesta has often tried to push that, keep distance between that term and his work. You know, but I embrace it completely because that's where I rooted myself, you know, gave myself a foundation for that. And so there was that part, the practical part, but then I was thinking about, but you know, I'm not gonna just do this. I'm not abandoning my career as an artist. So parallel to trying to figure out how to connect with the community, I started reading and trying to figure out how to connect this to some kind of artistic practice. And that's when I found Joseph Beuys' social sculpture. And that was a key moment for me to find that and start thinking about, you know, what does that mean? You know, what does social sculpture mean? And you know, and actually, I've been reading more Boys of late because I'm doing some stuff in Germany right now, and just kind of trying to just as a way of connecting myself to that space. And I'm sure my interpretation of social sculpture and how I embody it is very different than what he would have. But I've learned though to kind of take things in the most practical way as possible, in the most simple way as possible, because I know things automatically, if you work at it and you go deep enough, it's going to get complicated and messy, and so I don't have to start from that point. I try to start from simplicity, clarity, and so on and so forth. And so when I was thinking of social sculpture, I was thinking, okay, sculpting, a social environment within the context of a community kind of made sense to me. And so that's how I kind of got there, from rooting myself deeply into activism to figure out how to be within a context of practical solutions, and then bringing in and layering on this kind of conceptual framework for art that came out of kind of a Western conceptual base, but bringing those things together. So that's kind of how I got there.
And so you went to graduate. You can correct me if I'm wrong. You went to graduate school in Houston. Yes.
You know what's funny about this? Okay, so I had this long conversation with a brilliant painter that I just met the last few weeks, Stanley Whitney.
Yeah.
I knew of his work, but I'd never spent any time with him. And he's a real painter's painter. He's one of those kind of painters that go into the museum and go, oh my God, I can't stand this. Too many bad paintings in here. Too many bad paintings. It's like so like such a painter, and they just can't bear looking at paintings that doesn't quite, But anyway, so we had this long train ride together, and we were talking, and it was so funny. We were talking about how in the art world, people generally have assumptions about where people come from, their path, and so on. So based on where they are, you just kind of go, and so people often like kind of put me in I have no degrees. Yeah, I've gone through a lot of schools and that kind of stuff, but I just could not get to that point where I could stay focused long enough to well, actually, I do have some degrees, but they're
I've done my PhD.
They're
totally understandable.
I have like honorary degrees. I don't have any like real ones.
This is pretty real. So I'm curious though. How did you decide to root the practice in Houston? How did that decision happen? And what kind of reconnaissance did you do in that community to understand its needs before beginning the project in earnest?
Yeah. Well, I had been. This has really got me thinking about all these things that kind of made me who I am. Because while I was making paintings and sculptures about political and social issues, I was still being an activist. I was doing all kind of stuff around, issues of, divestment from South Africa, police brutality issues, all that stuff. I was actively involved in that, at that time. So when I closed studio, it wasn't like I closed studio and then became an activist. I was already doing that at the time, and so I just kind of floated around, really rooted myself at the base of some of the community activists in Houston, and did something that I always tell young people nowadays that are interested in doing the work is to find mentors, that are in communities that are doing work, and just and just kind of allow yourself to be a helper. And to learn, kind of almost in an apprentice kind of way. We've lost that because now everybody wants to come out of the gate and be, they want to be the artist, they want to be at the forefront. But so that's how I kind of rooted myself as a community center there. That's called a Shape Community Center, and I would go there, 3 or 4 times a week, 5 times a week, attend all the meetings, and pass out flyers, do all the kind of the grunt work, just, and so slowly I started to get the confidence of people that were the the leading activists in the community, and then I could get them to start responding to the art things that I was interested in. And so so after doing a lot of kind of smaller scale art things with these community groups, when I came up with this idea of Project Row Houses, which I was from the 3rd Ward of Houston, which is a predominantly African American community. I wasn't from there, but because I had all these activists who were from that community that had a great level of respect, that they were the ones that kind of signed off on me to do the work there.
Mm-hmm.
That kind of cleared the way to be able to dive into the 3rd Ward.
Mm-hmm. So, just adopting the compare and contrast method, because it's the Wolf-Lenian method in art history, just because it helps people see, it helps me see. I've been listening to you speak, and I think one thing that distinguishes, say, you from Mark is the fact that there's a kind of radical decoupling that happens in him.
Mm.
So the studio work is the studio work,
Yeah.
and that's become more emphatic over time, actually.
Mm.
So a lot of that material isn't scavenged anymore. A lot of that material is printed and used specifically for the purpose of painting.
Right.
So just as that's become more cloistered, the kind of social dimension of art and practice has become more and more pronounced.
Right.
But there's not much space in between. So in the case of your work, the activism is the work, and the work is the activism.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I always kind of struggle with this idea of finding the form.
Mm.
Finding the form in the work.
Right.
And one of the things that I'm dealing with a lot now in training myself, because I'm often like trying to teach myself and learn about this practice that I'm in. So I have to just have little experiments that I do on my own. And one of the things that I've picked up from is I picked it up from a mentor of mine. I have many mentors from different walks of life. I have artist mentors. I have social worker mentors. I have all kind. I mean, I just people that are doing things that I'm interested in. I try to find people that I can latch onto and say, And I always tell people when they say, when we talk about mentors, I tell them I like people who I respect what they're doing, and I get enough of a relationship with them that I can trust that they will tell me the truth.
Mm.
That becomes a big thing about mentors, is having people that will just tell you, when you're kind of going off or whatever. But anyway, so this one mentor of mine, artist, his name is Jesse Lott, and he makes a lot of his work mainly is made from found objects, discarded material. And one of the things I've learned about him, this guy's studio is amazing. I mean, it's a big giant warehouse, and it's full of so much shit.
Mm.
Because this guy can't drive, a half a block without stopping 3 or 4 times to pick something up. He's always picking things up. And one of the things he always say is that, it's like, well, you don't need to think about making too much. You just need to know how to see it.
Mm.
And that's, and to me that was a really interesting thing, right? Because he would always pick up things. He goes, see that right there? Look at it real good. Turn it over. It's like, how do you see things? Because there's so much that's before us already. But we're so obsessed with the idea that we have to make something that have value as opposed to seeing something that has value. And so I've been thinking about that a lot in terms of kind of the formal aspects of my work and how it manifests itself. And trying to relieve some of the pressure of having to think about creating form that conforms to the standards of kind of Western aesthetics, and really being able to just kind of see the beauty and aesthetics of forms that may already kind of exist, and figuring out how to get people to understand those. Yeah, and so that's kind of a thing that I play with, in terms of the activism and the aesthetics of it.
So it's interesting. I was teaching a class in New York, it was maybe 2 months ago, and we were discussing exactly these issues. And so a lot of the class they were graduate students, a lot of them were painters and sculptors, and we were talking about in the broadest sense, social practice, what that means as an evolving term in the art world. And a lot of them were quite conservative in the way they approached the history of art. And they said, well, how is, I was showing images of your work, images of art and praxis, and they said, well, how is that art? I don't see how that's art. Now, I could answer it, 7 ways to Sunday and convince them of it.
Mm-hmm.
But I think that this the issue of finding form, your sort of constant struggle with that is a really fascinating way to answer the question. So when somebody looks at an image of Project Row House and says, how is that art? You could say,
we've gotten lazy. People are lazy. They want it to be like that. And also, it's kind of, I use this quote a lot. It's an Oscar Wilde quote that says that nowadays people know the price of everything but the value of nothing, right? So, just basically, people, they know that something's art when they can say, oh, well, that's a painting. And there's beauty there, there's, whatever. That's like the price of things.
Or uselessness.
Yeah.
I think about this all the time, the
right.
Kantian idea, that art's fundamental utility is its uselessness.
Yeah.
This was going to be my crescendo, but whatever, we'll just go there right now. But the idea that we've left that fundamentally, I believe, in this country in particular, and I would say it's quite specific to the African American community, we've left that idea behind.
Yeah.
Uselessness is no longer, that's not a badge of honor. There's an idea that application needs to be a part of the process.
Yeah. No, absolutely. But
anyway,
you
give your answer.
No. I'm not going to touch that. We'll say that. But Tanya Bagheera was doing this whole thing around useful art, and trying to, really, instigate a conversation to reignite that conversation about, the possibility of art being, useful, and not just being something that, if it's not useful, then it must be art, kind of thing. And I think that's something that is, it's one of those things I think that we have to somehow figure out to demand that people are a little bit more sophisticated than that, that they can actually find, high value beauty in things that has that as its core or as the essence, without necessarily having to connect it to whether it's useful or not. Those are just, that to me, that's not a good platform to work from.
Yeah, it's a fascinating thing because I think if it became a fundamental requirement that art have a conventional or traditional utility, then how do you distinguish that medium of expression, let's say, from design or from architecture, the creation of useful space? Architecture has been struggling with this since its beginnings. I find it interesting that art has been given a pass on that front for millennia, literally. But now the terms are changing slightly. But if art is to remain art, but utility is some dimension of it, what does that object look like? That seems to me very complicated.
Yeah.
But
No.
not my problem, it's your problem.
No, well, I tell you what's even a bigger problem that I'm concerned with around the utility of art as it relates to my practice is connected to the new terminology of placemaking and that kind of stuff. That, it's, there's this whole movement around, the utility of art in the process of building communities and that kind of stuff. And that, and while on the one hand, I appreciate the desire for that, the practicality of art, because that's where I kind of got in it from that point. But I also know that if you reduce art to that level, then you're missing the point. You're missing the best of it. If you're gonna look at the value of art based on its ability to address some practical, function within society, then you're just, you're gonna miss it. You're gonna, it's kind of, I always tell people, that's coming. This whole placemaking thing is, artists are all falling into this trap too, right? Because of funding or resources that are attached to it. But, people want to know, so what's the impact of this work on the community? How many, I actually had, there was a conversation on a blog with this guy, Ben Davis. Are you familiar with him? He's a critic. He writes, he's a very smart and interesting guy. But he wrote an article, he writes for a number of journals, but he wrote for the International Socialist Review. And he wrote this article that was critical of social practice. And it was based on the premise of the fact that artists boast the practical aspects of this art and how it impacts. But it's not really, I mean, it's, if you look at the numbers of things, it's just not happening. You can't justify it. And he used Project Row as one of the case studies that how to critique it, right? Which is a very good critique. He basically said, okay, so Project Row Houses is something that people say is like, one of the, best kind of social practice projects around. And one of the things it supposedly addresses housing. He said, well, the last time I checked in Houston, well, he said, no, I said, like, yeah, they have like, 50 or 60 or 70 units of housing. But the last time I checked, the housing prices in Houston was something like, tens of thousands. And it's like, so how do you, what value is that? I mean, that's just a little drop in the bucket. So, but if you start trying to, if you start trying to say that the value of Project Row Houses is in the number of units that it can provide, then there's no way we're going to win. Because if we start producing at that level, then it's not going to be with the same kind of thoughtfulness, same kind of poetics, the same kind of aesthetics, the same all the layered stuff that we put into our work. You'd lose it on that kind of scale, and so it's a real dangerous thing with this whole movement around what's the practical implication and impact of artists working in community context.
I mean, I think that we'll return to Project Row House in a second, though. I think it's infinitely defensible on the basis that, I mean, frankly, if somebody says, well, why did you save one life when there are 1,000 people who are going to die? I mean, the answer to that should be self-evident, because you could save one. So to me, the numerical imbalance between the need in Houston and what you're providing through your work is completely immaterial to its impact, I think.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And but he had a really good, it was a good warning, I think, to artists who were doing this work to just don't play that game. So he wrote the article, and then there was a blog conversation about it through the Blade of Grass, that's a group in New York, and so it was Tom Picklefurl, who has been a champion of my work for a long time, Nato Thompson from Creative Time, and a few other people, and they were like really upset about the article. I thought it was really good and thoughtful, but in doing the dialogue, someone brought up the fact, I think maybe Ben brought up the fact, it was right after Hurricane Sandy, and somehow he had found this photo of a group of artists who had been doing work on Long Island after the hurricane, doing good work, right? So, but they got a little overzealous. They had this poster board with like 5 or 6 of them standing behind it, and written on the poster board, it said, "We got this." And it's like, no, you don't. I mean, it's like this false bolstering of the artist, that the artist can solve this. And it's like, no, we can't. But we can speak to it, and we can speak to it in powerful ways that connect language to things and emotions to things and move people in ways to do. But you know what? We can't do it. It's not our responsibility to do that. And I think, but I think we position ourselves sometimes to play into that by saying, that's what we do. We can solve this problem. The language of artists. People talk about art can solve problems here and there, whatever. Actually, all the way to the point I saw just recently, the mayor of LA, there was an article in the LA Times about the mayor there posting of requests for applications for artists who they wanted to bring in to do work to end bicycle deaths in LA. So they were going to create an artist residency within the city, a 2-year residency that was a $25,000 stipend to it. And artists are going to solve this issue. It's like, that's a pretty good deal if you can do it, right? But so people get this idea of that it's a magical, potion that you can just kind of, put out there.
Wave it on.
Yeah.
So I'm mindful of leaving time for questions, but I wanted to ask you just a couple more searching questions about Project Roadhouse, bearing in mind that I, like Nathan Thompson, believe it is an incredible example of success in this area. So could you speak a little bit about the structure of Project Roadhouse as it's evolved over time, maybe where it began and its various tentacles now? And then just practically, I'm interested in this too, how you sustain it. What is your model of sustainability for that?
I don't know if I have a model, but it's just I think the model is persistence and and just kind of sticking with it is kind of the model. But and as it relates to other folks and how they do their work, for me, I consider myself the founder of Project Roadhouse. That's how I describe myself. But I've never described myself as the director of Project Roadhouse. I've never been the director. I mean, I've always wanted to have. I've always wanted an outside position so that I could be, so I could take on that role of the artist to be critical of my own work. Because I know directors have a different responsibility than artists. I mean, directors have to make things work. They have to, they do have to deal with numbers. They have to report to people that they're getting money from and all this kind of stuff. But as an artist, I can just sit back and just talk about, the connection of the aesthetics or the poetics or whatever, and just push and push and push. I mean, that's always been my thing. And it's really interesting. I see a lot of other artists that, kind of move themselves into being directors. And I always advise not, because it limits the kind of, it limits the ability to push things. And I think that's the greatest thing that I bring to the projects that I work on, is that kind of independent position that I can actually push against it.
And then just the units within Project Roadhouse. So you have residencies, of course. You have artist residency programs. You have studios. So could you just describe the physical structure?
Yeah. So there's the programmatic side is artist projects, residency activities, studios, and so on and so forth. But then there's education. There's social services. And then there's kind of, economic sustainability things, like housing development and so on and so forth. But what the interesting thing, one of the sustainable aspects of it, which is really hard, is to keep people in the mode of flexibility and change. So a good example of that is that when we started our education program, we started it based on a reality at that moment in time, where we were a group of people cleaning up this site, and young people from the neighborhood saw what was going on. They wanted to be a part, and so they started coming around, and we had an informal kind of relationship with the children that showed up. But then over time, we formalized it because it just made sense. But those were, but over time, the neighborhoods kind of shift. And there's been a lot of people displaced, and so, but while there are people displaced, we've been building houses to bring new people in, and so now we have some 70 something rental houses. So these are people that we're building our own community, and then so the question is that I put to the staff and the director of Project Horizon is like, okay, how do we utilize that energy around education to actually focus on the education of the people that we're providing housing for, which there are young people in it, so it's, we still address issues of youth. But there are other people, there are the parents and seniors and so on and so forth. All those people, my motto I've been pushing on people is that everybody should have an educational agenda. And how are we providing a framework for that to happen? And so trying to get an institution to move in that direction, because institutions want to just keep doing the same, they'll just keep doing the same thing, and so I think it was about 4 years ago that I agitated them so much on this thing about, that they finally disband the traditional after-school and summer education program and start operating educationally more like a social service agency, doing casework with each household. And so approaching education in that way. Yeah.
So I'm going to ask you one more question, then turn it over to the audience. Given where you are with that project, is there something you've always wanted to do that you've never been able to do, you've never had the resources to achieve? Is there an aspect of it that has yet to be realized?
To step away for an entire year and not have to be connected. I haven't been able to do that yet. No, but there are always things that we want to do, but we just can't quite do it for different reasons. But I always, there's that practical side to it though, is, being able to take those things that I may personally want to see, but putting them in relationship to the things that the community has really kind of identified that need to happen. And that's the big challenge, is really being comfortable with the fact that you can have these personal aspirations and things that you want, but the most important thing is not that. It's the aspiration of the broader thing, and figuring out how do you find life and excitement within that way of doing it, and usually it all pops up. One of the I'm really it's like Project Warehouses for me. It's like 1994 again. That's kind of when we started, 1993, 94. This year is like 1994 again, because back then we were dealing with a neighborhood that had no investment for 25 years. It was just nothing happening. So it was dying. Now, 20 years later, it's like under the pressure and being strangled by overinvestment, the gentrification thing, right? So there's like all this pressure's coming real estate wise, and and at a certain point, it's kind of like in 1994, looking at those old houses and just thinking, God, we're never going to get this. This is just not going to happen. Why don't we just forget it and just leave? And then, looking at it now and just thinking, oh my God, real estate has gone up so much more, and it's I don't know if we're going to be able to do this, right? But that persistence in just staying there, all of a sudden, I ended up getting a call. This is in January, from the wealthiest family in Houston, that heard about what we were doing, and they have this research foundation, and now they're trying to figure out how to do some practical work, see if they can bring it together or whatever, and they want to take this on as a project to be able to see how far we can scale this thing up in terms of matching the gentrification that's coming in, which is I would have never thought that moment would be there, right? Because I was about last year about to say, yeah, maybe we just need to just fold up and say, we've done all we can do. But now there's this new, possibility. But with the new possibility of always, complicated things that make it, make it challenging and exciting. So one of the big challenges of this thing is that, so I have a state representative who's a dynamic guy, he's really great, powerful, on our side. It took a long time to get him there, it's been really great. And I've had to connect him to this new partner. And when I connected him to him, he goes, when I said their name, he just kind of space just went blank. And I was like, what's going on? He goes, those are Ted Cruz Republicans. And I was like, okay. I was like, so what do you do? What am I going to do with that? You know, and it's been really interesting, right? So, you know, and it's a big deal for him because, you know, I mean, there's an ideological thing there. I mean, he cares about what's happening to the community, and he's doing everything that he can to do it. But, you know, as a politician, ideologically, you know, he's a Democrat, and, you know, it just doesn't work for him to be connected. But for me, as someone who's kind of focused on, you know, the work that's on the ground, I mean, this is not at a theoretical level. This is at a practical, you know, how do we leverage resources to move these things in a way that's going to have impact on people within this community without allowing that work to be leveraged or usurped by ideology, you know? And so that's like the big challenge that's been really interesting for me. It's kind of playing between, you know, these two opposing groups and trying to figure out how you eke this thing out and to see where it's going to go in the next, you know, 5 to 10 years. It'll be interesting.
It will. So we've now spoken for 50 minutes, which was slightly more than I'd anticipated, but we'd love it. Any questions from the audience?
So you spoke really eloquently and really passionately about the work you're doing on the ground. What does it look like? What does your footing look like in the art world? What are you doing to have visibility there, and how are you bringing the work on the ground into the art world? Are you having gallery shows? How do you cross that divide fluidly?
Yeah. Good question. I have to think about that a lot, right? Because, you know, on the one hand, you know, I say, art can be where it is. It doesn't have to be, you know, in museums or galleries or whatever. It can be where it is, and it's okay. But I also know that there's a power, and you know, there are resources connected to the art world in that way. And so I'm careful and thoughtful about trying to, you know, generally it kind of happens like every 4 or 5 years there are opportunities to do something within the quote unquote the art world way. And but then I also, you know, I mean, I play around in other kind of community things that's not connected to art world stuff. And so yeah, so I mean, so I'll do things with like my last project. I'll talk about this project tomorrow. Translation, which was commissioned by the National Sculpture Center in Dallas, which was, you know, I mean, it was, you know, so that, you know, keeping those connections, you know, and like doing things at LA MoCA, and, you know, I'll be doing something at Documenta next year. So, you know, so those little, you know, just kind of keeping it there, you know, on some way, but not allowing that to be the thing that dictates, you know, all the energy.
I just think there's a real democratic sort of approach to what's going on with Project Row House, and I happen to be an artist who exhibited there, so I kind of carry that with me. And so when I have an opportunity to talk about it, this kind of idea of social practice, it's something that I'm connected to in my experience, and so that's sort of, it's out there. It's out there.
Yeah, and that's a good point too. Is to me, it's about having lived within other artists, you know, and you know, and now more and more, I'm kind of, I guess because I am the granddaddy now, you know, beginning to look at how this worked for younger artists, and trying to position the work in ways that it can live through, you know, younger artists that are. So in general now, when I do projects in different places, I try to find younger artists that I could work with and collaborate with them, and position them in a way that they can actually, you know, connect themselves to work to carry on in their own communities.
I was really struck by this phrase of finding the form in the work. And one of the things that I know, I was recently talking to Carol Stenkenis, who teaches at the museum school here, and we were talking about a practice that she had with her students where they were using like a Rosalind Krauss diagram of the medium, but thinking about it for social practice. So what are the kind of orienting points of that square, and how do they cross and relate? And I just wondered if you could expand any more, like if you feel like that kind of medium specificity argument, which is a very kind of traditional one in a way, has any sort of place or practice in social practice and in your work and in finding the form. I know it's something that I know some students who are involved with the MFAs in social practice. I mean, they seem to be like populating more and more and migrating, and it's a challenge because what is it that you're teaching, and what are the kind of other fields that you find orienting points? So I just wanted to throw it out.
Yeah, I mean, from a thinking standpoint, I connect. I mean, I was trained as a painter, so so when I look at, social forms, I'm using the language, the training that I have in that way to see or to look for form. So I'm using the same kind of tools. But because I think the work that we're investigating in the social context, because it's so new, I think it's hard to be able to connect it in such a direct way. And I do believe this. I do believe that, in 50 years maybe, people will look back and say, I mean, the kind of social practice and socially engaged work that we're doing now will be very clunky and not quite, it would just, I think it will advance, much further down the line, and people will understand it and be able to, I'm sure it was the same way with folks that talking about, conceptual stuff, it's a very, clunky start to it, or land art, all those things, it's kind of, how do you, this stuff doesn't make any sense, but now we have a much better sense of what it, what it means. There's somebody up here. Nope.
Yes, can I go?
Oh, yeah.
I'm going. Thank you so much. I wanted to know what your response to the MacArthur Award was, and if that changed at all your relationship to your own practice, either by mobilizing something that wasn't realized before.
Well, I think actually, the MacArthur Award is kind of interesting because it's such a, it's, they're so low key in terms of how they administer that program, but it's become such a, it sets the standard for what people think about, people professionally. And it also is kind of like showing in a particular gallery. It sets your price at a certain level, and people know, okay, well this artist is valuable because they have this award. And I actually think that it's because of that I was able to get these folks. I mean, I came to their attention through being a MacArthur fellow. Had I not been a MacArthur fellow, I think I probably would still be scratching my head on how to deal with this, this gentrification issue. But it just opened up, those possibilities. The network, I think, that's the main thing. The network just expanded. Yeah.
I believe that I've read that you're doing some kind of project in Philadelphia, so I want to ask you a question about that, because as I've come to understand Project Row Houses, it seems to me that so much of the power and the beauty of it, and its excellence in so many dimensions, has to do with its rootedness in a community, and your rootedness in that community, and your deep knowledge of the sources of resilience that emerge from that community. So I just wonder what it's like for you to do something probably time limited in a different community, and what principles kind of inform your practice in a different place.
Yeah. That's a good question. It's something that I've been, struggling with, and I learned a lot from working on this project in Philadelphia, actually, and that it clarified something for me. When I started working on that project, it was like, it was so difficult because I didn't have, there were so many challenges with the institution I was working with, and it was just like hard. And someone asked me once, when I was going through these struggles, they asked me, they said, so what were the most essential things that you had that made Project Row Houses possible? I mean, what was the one thing that you would say that if you didn't have that, it wouldn't have happened? And it boiled down to me was time. It was all about time. I had the time to be there when nobody else was there, consistently, so on and so forth. It was that kind of ability to be persistent and present, whatever, that made it possible. And then so I started thinking about the challenges that I have when I'm working in other places. The big challenge is that I don't have the time that I used to have. I don't have the time. The most essential quality I don't have. And so what I started to think about was, so then what's the other side of it, outside of time? It's like access to resources, whether it's monetary and so, that kind of stuff. And I was thinking, okay, well, my networks, I have a lot more access to resources, now than I did then. So things have kind of flipped upside down. Then I had lots of time, no resources. Now I have access to resources, no time. So then I was thinking about how do I resolve that? That's how I started investing in young people, or people within communities, is to really try to find folks who are passionate about the work that they're doing in their communities, and they have time, right? And then I proceed to collaborate with them based on the fact that they have time, and I have resources of experience, networks, so on and so forth, and and so I'm playing with that as a way of addressing that, because you're right, that rootedness and all that stuff is extremely important.
All right, one more question. Ganit.
Okay. I have a complicated question, and I'm not sure if I know how to ask it, but I'm going to try. First of all, thank you both so much. I want to go back to Kant. I have a feeling that accepting Kant's, I guess people read the English translation of his critique of aesthetic judgment, which is probably translated in a wrong way and sets up a really faulty premise that has governed Western art, especially painting and sculpture in Europe and then in the United States for a few hundred years. And that has nothing to do with the creativity and the creation of beauty and aesthetics in other parts of the world, which has always been part of life. And viewing the film and seeing people naturally seek beauty as something for your soul that is no less useful than something like food or something. So I said something too many times, I think. But seeing the project and seeing people feel the need for community, for beauty, for creativity, for an outlet for self-expression, it seems obvious that we should not accept the premise of what Western art forms are because they're man-made. And I say man-made because they also marginalized quilts and African art and a lot of other art forms. So maybe we should just throw away certain parts of Kant the way that Joseph Beuys did. I mean, it's not a coincidence that he's German and he read Kant and he rejected it. So maybe the very premise is wrong. I don't know if that's a question.
No, I agree that, and I'll talk about this a little bit in my talk tomorrow and kind of show some examples of how I'm thinking about this in my work. But, you know, I think that one of, you know, the thing that attracted me to Joseph Boys' theory of social sculpture was this desire on a theoretical basis to actually acknowledge the creative input, the creative output, whatever, of everybody.
Right.
You know, that everybody has a, you know, it's not, you know, creativity is the root of all, you know, arts. You know, and so he didn't just limit it to the practitioners of the quote unquote fine art. You know,
Right.
It's like everybody has to do that. I mean, everybody has to act as an artist. And you know, and I think the most powerful thing about that statement is that, you know, it encouraged people to actually, you know, see the beauty and be acknowledged, you know, for the beauty that they create themselves, that may not fit within the criteria of, you know, Western ways of thinking about it, but that's just one way.
Right.
And it's okay for it to happen in other ways. But the challenge, though, with the West view is that it just can't figure out how to be secure in its own identity and celebrate others' identity at the same time. I mean, and that's, you know, that's the problem we have, you know, not just in art and in culture, but in society in general. Right? I mean, we just can't let we can't feel secure in our place in society without diminishing the presence of other people.
I would say that's an excellent ending. So we got a lot of Rick today, so
Yeah.
thank you. But if you need more, tomorrow at 3:30 at Shapiro.
Yeah.
But we want to thank you sincerely for being so present and so thoughtful, for your work and for coming to Brandeis. It's been a great pleasure.
I'm glad to be here.